Well, before the invention of machines, every fiber had to be spun by hand. And the very first fibers were done with a stick. And you had to spin your fiber into a yarn before you could make cloth for your clothing or for any of your needs. And this was done for thousands and thousands of years. For everything you wore, you had to spin it by hand. And it took a lot of people and a lot of labor to make everything they needed. And I am very unpracticed, but this is the way it was done. I'm spinning sheep wool, which is the easiest fiber to spin. But you see that you pull it out and let the twist run up the thread. And then when you get it so long, then you wind it onto the spindle. This is a drop spindle, yes. Sometimes just a plain stick was used. Sometimes they would roll it up their leg, you know. But people would spin, they would walk around and spin because you had to spin all day long. It's just how you made your thread to make anything that you wanted to use for your household or to wear, that this had to be done. So it was a very time-consuming task for lots of, mainly women. It was mainly a women's chore. But this is how thread was made. And I was spinning sheep wool, but this is flax that I spun. And people would use the flax we call linen, you know, for their bed covers or their sheets or their towels or their clothing as well. This is the flax plant. It grows into a plant. Mine is very skinny. It grows a little thicker, you know, but I was just practicing just to see what I could get. And then you would crush the stems, strip off the fiber, and I've got some here. You strip off the fiber, and then you would also spin it either on the drop spindle or on the spinning wheel to make yarn.
Do you happen to know about the approximate time that people began using spinning wheels and stopped using the drop spindle?
I can tell you approximately. I love this book, Prehistoric Textiles, because the Egyptians were so good about depicting all their work on urns and vases and things like that. So there's tons of drawn pictures, and it was preserved so well in their tombs and things like that. So we can learn so much history, prehistoric history, from the Egyptians. And they did all the spinning. They primarily used flax until they started interacting with other cultures. Then they didn't really need the wool because it was so hot and dry. But so flax was their choice. But they did finally spin wool as well. And spinning on the drop spindle happened until about the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is when the first spinning wheel was invented, probably India. It took 200 more years before they improved that one. So it's the Renaissance period when they made it a little more modern, and I have a version that would be similar to the Renaissance. And then it didn't change again until the Industrial Revolution, and they had the spinning jenny, powered by water power. And then, of course, we know after that everything went fast. But it took thousands of years, to get away from this type of work. Of course, other fibers that you would spin would be the cotton, which came later. This was older. This and hemp were older. Then, of course, sheep herding, we know, was a very ancient occupation. So sheep herding. So people spun the wool. And then it was much later that they started cultivating and spinning cotton. I've heard that it's called the poor man's cotton. But cotton comes in so many different colors. It also comes in a green. So it's very fun to look at all the different shades of cotton. Now those are the only three I'm familiar with. So when it became white, I don't really know. I don't know that much history of the cotton. But it's, anyway, cotton, I finally learned to spin it. It's very difficult.
So out of all of the fibers, which one is the easiest?
Well, wool is the easiest. Flax I learned to do well, you just have to have water. You have to use, your fingers have to be wet with the plants. You just have to have water. But you can also spin paper. This is paper.
So how do you prepare that to spin it?
Some of this is cotton, is coffee filters, which you cut into little strips. Some pages out of paper, out of a booklet. Some of your junk mail.
Yeah.
And then you can dye it. You use coffee filters sometimes to filter your dyes anyway, so you've got all that source. And then you just spin it. I've never done it on the drop spindle. I've got a little homemade spinning wheel in here that I prefer to use. But anyway, it's sort of fun. And people weave with it. But of course, it's not going to hold up for washing and things like that. But it's just, fun. Of course, we have the cordage, the other plants like this is blackberry vine that makes beautiful cordage. You wouldn't necessarily make clothing out of it, but you could use it for ropes or mats or purses, bags, things like that. So your plant cordage. To think that anything you had to use, you had to make.
Yes.
There was thousands of years that you didn't go to the store. Thousands of years. And then, of course, after you spin your fiber, then you had to go forage for plants, to dye it, the different colors, the onion skin, the Osage orange, the sumac berries, lichen. It's just black walnut, lots of different plants then that we made our dyes. And then on the trading market, when South America was discovered, there was all these cactus beetles. So this is the cochineal.
And it gives you what colors?
Pinks and reds. And then, you can get that color of red with a little work. Pink is its first color. And then there's a root, this madder root, very ancient dye, the madder root. Middle Eastern people, used it primarily and traded it on that trade route. But it finally came to this country.
And it grows here currently?
You can grow it, but it's not native necessarily here. But we have a similar plant. It's the agalium type plant, catchweed, they call it that. Anyway, the roots of, I have that plant somewhere, but I didn't dig it out to show us. But anyway, the most ancient of the dyes then are the indigo and the madder root. They're the two ancient. And then the cochineal's probably next. But of course, all the native plants that will yield a dye has been used forever. So, but this is primarily the first steps of spinning your yarn and then dyeing it. We talked earlier about the drop spindle being used for thousands of years, and then about the Middle Ages, someone decided to put a drive band onto a spindle using the big wheel to help you with your speed, and created this type of spinning wheel. But it was the Middle Ages before this happened, probably in India. Seems like they get the credit for the first spinning wheel. Probably didn't look exactly like this, but then this became was used by our pioneers here in the United States for many years as well, because not everybody could afford to buy the cloth from England. But the way this works, the big wheel is driving the spindle with this drive band, and as this turns, your spindle is going fast. I would normally do it this way, but I'm having a little technical problem. But anyway, this is spinning. As you can see, it's spinning my sheep wool as we go. I will stop every now and then, and I'll draft it a little bit. But then that's our way of creating yarn with the big walking wheel, they call it, because you're usually walking far, and I just broke it. So.
Do you also spin flax on that wheel?
Yeah, you can.
And cotton.
And they did. Mm-hmm. The difference in spinning the wools and the cottons mostly is, you have to get a lot more twist on those plant fibers than you have to on wool. So you can use any spinning wheel to spin any fiber. Your technique has to be slightly different. But after you spin a while, then you have to stop and you have to wind it onto the spindle. I've got a little corn shuck bobbin on my spindle, so I can just slide it off when I'm through. But this was the way they spun actually, even though they developed these in the Renaissance, they developed this mechanism where it has this flower, they call it. That's new, and putting petals on it. All that didn't happen till after the Renaissance. But as you can tell, because of our own country, these stayed in favor for many years.
So when the colonists came, they brought the big wheels.
They brought the big wheels. They had, we were founded in the 1600s, and they probably didn't start making these, till after the 1600s. So our first people would have brought these. And they kept using them over and over for many years. And then those that could afford the more modern version would buy these. They're
So you can spin any fiber on any wheel then?
You can spin any fiber on any wheel. You just have to change your tensions, your speed, and just your technique.
Well, I can see why these would become more popular, just because of the space.
They took up less space. They were very efficient, because you didn't have to stand here and do all this work.
Right.
Your feet could do more of the work.
The next step, once you have spun your fibers, is what?
When you fill up a bobbin, and this bobbin belongs to this type spinning wheel, when you fill up your bobbin, you would fill up usually 2, and then you would put them back on the spinning wheel to ply them. You would ply 2 together like this to make it stronger thread. So I would spin it again by applying 2 together. And then after that was over, then I would take a tool. This one is actually called, let me get this separated. This is called a niddy-noddy. I don't know why.
That's a good name.
The niddy-noddy, then you would make your skein by winding on the niddy-noddy. Like that. And, then you make your skein, then you're ready to dye. But this one, I won't continue making a skein because this is just a single ply, and I want to spin more and make a double ply before I spin it, but I'll leave it on here for now. This is the part of an old spinning wheel, that has the Sleeping Beauty spindle. I'd take this to show the children that this is what it would look like, because I can't take this with me, and this one has no pointy spindle, so I like to take this for my example. Are we ready? These are carders, and as you can tell, the wool is pretty matted up, and you need to smooth it out in order to spin. So you would card it, and you would make it as smooth and free of debris. You hope that's not much in there, and you want it in a parallel, some type of parallel position in order to spin the fibers. So we call this a rolag, but now it's ready for me to spin. There's other ways of doing the carders. When you're carding cotton, though, some people think you card cotton in order to get the seeds out, but that's not true. You had to use a gin to remove the seeds or pick them out by hand, and you would card cotton mainly making bats for your quilts. You wouldn't necessarily, I don't even like to card cotton for spinning. I like to spin right off the bowl, but for wool we need it in a good position. So this is our Renaissance version of a spinning wheel, and my feet will do a lot of work and my hands do the rest. But it spins and it's pulling onto the bobbin, and there are a lot of adjustments on this type spinning wheel for tensions.
Was it difficult for you to learn that, I guess, the finer points of spinning as far as the tensions? Is that the hardest part? Or?
It is difficult at first. You can read about it. Your manuals come with all kinds of instructions, but you have to try it and realize that if it's going too fast, you just got a lot of kinked up yarn. So you have to learn how to pedal slower, and your tension can't be too tight. You also, for this type spinning wheel, it has to draw in. There's a point where it won't draw in at all. Then there's a point where it'll go too fast. So you do have to learn all those things, and you just finally learned what works.
How long have you been spinning, Jeanette?
I bought my first spinning wheel in about 2000, so it's been 20 years. I mainly wanted to have something to dye. Dyeing was what I wanted to do, and so I had to learn to spin, because then I decided, well, if you're going to naturally dye, then you must naturally make your own yarn. So that's how I started.
Talking about one thing leading to another.
But actually, really what happened is that my sister went to art school and got a weaving degree, and she let me borrow a weaving loom. So actually, really, I learned to weave, and then I had to go, well, I want to dye my own yarns, and then so, okay, I've got to now spin my own thread. So it progressed from actually weaving. Cordage, a lot of fibers, such as we talked about flax earlier, comes from a plant, and this is the dogbane, or the Indian hemp plant, and you normally harvest plants like this after frost, supposedly, but any other time of the year would work. But you have to scrape off all this red outer bark, and I've done that in this picture. I've scraped all the red bark, and then you crush the stem, and then you can start pulling the fibers. You see the fibers are coming off this. And those fibers then are what you would use to spin. You can spin it actually on a drop spindle, or what I like to do, I'm going to show it on fabric because it's easier to show it on fabric. But what you will do with those strings, you would start, let's see, let me go this way. You will twist we've got 2 going. We twist the back one and then bring it forward. Then we twist the new back one and then bring it forward. Twist, bring it forward. And so we're plying those 2 together. We're twisting as we go and plying at the same time. So twist, bring forward, twist, bring forward. And so here we go with, that's the same way that you would use for plant cordage. It's easier to see it with this 2-colored fabric.
Yes.
But then that would be for rope making or any other cordage. And like I said, you can still put some of them on the spinning wheel or the drop spindle. But some of them, such as the cedar's a little coarse. You know, this is your bark wood. So I had to take my limb and scrape off all the outer coating. And I left a little bit because I like the color. But this inner bark is your fiber. And you would peel off some of that. It needs to be wet. I'll see. I can't do really good spinning or twisting with it dry, but you know, you would twist back, bring forward, twist back. But for a good cordage, I would need to wet it first. But you see it's starting to make the rope. So, and just hand twisting is, you know, the good way to do it. So
what are some of the other fibers that you have used for cordage?
Earlier I talked about the blackberry. A blackberry is similar to this. You clip off the cane of a blackberry vine. You strip off the leaves and thorns. You have to scrape all the dark outer coating first. Then you, let's see, here's another one. You scrape off the outer coating because everything has like 3 layers, an outer coating, an inner core, and then the inside is the fiber. Once you scrape off the outer core, you crush the stem, and then you can start peeling off the fiber from the inner core. And without having one to show you, that's hard to really explain. But anyway, this is the inner fiber. And then you would start twisting that into cordage. You can boil it with some alkali like washing soda or lye to lighten it. This has been lightened. I've used my hibiscus stems to make this cordage. If you can see it. You know, it makes I was able to get a very fine cordage from my hibiscus stem, but it's very similar. It's got the outer coating, it's got the inner core, and then you just have to get the fibers in between the 2. The willow tree makes a pretty cordage. I stripped that from just about a month ago. So it's retaining its green color right now. It may finally fade to a brown because the green doesn't necessarily always stay. And one of my uses for some of my weaving was to make this rattle. I wove.
Oh, Jeanette, that is so cool.
This is the only one I've ever done, but I had to make myself a rattle. The top part, I ran out of my iris leaves that I was using, so I had to finish it with raffia. So the top part is raffia, but all this is iris. That was fun.
I think your artistic muse comes from a long time ago.
I guess. But I had, you know, my whole reason for wanting to do cordage mainly was for something like that.
Yeah.
That was fun. This was made from hemp, but it's, you know, it is a commercially made something, but still it's the same fiber, you know, that came from a plant like this. So, I bought that just because I had to have an example of something actually made from hemp.
Yeah.
I haven't made anything yet. So.
Have you ever worked with bamboo? I noticed a lot of textiles and whole kinds of stuff are now made from bamboo.
Yeah, it takes a lot more processing than we realize. It's not just something you can just strip and start using. You have to really do some work. So, no, and probably won't ever, because I would never probably be able to do that. And some of these could probably be softened up, to use for textiles, but mainly those are pretty rough cordage, and you would use it mainly for things not for clothing. Your hemp, your flax, your cotton, of course, those plants are soft, can be softened to make clothing.
And the stiffer fibers would have probably been baskets or bags or mats or sleeping mats or whatever.
Belts, any kind of rope.
I've read about some Native American burials found with the cedar woven mats, so I know they were used for that.
I read a lot about fibers and things like that. I'm not sure the truth to any of it, but it was said that George Washington brought the marijuana hemp to this country. And he brought it because that plant made the strongest ropes, and they needed it for the naval, for the ships. And so he was responsible for bringing it to this country.
Right, and I understand now it's being grown again for the fiber.
And they say that's a bit different. Well, there are different kinds of hemps. Some have no drug or hardly any at all, and that's what I'm understanding is being grown now, the one with very little drug. Not, but anyway, but the marijuana hemp does seem to make the strongest fibers. So after we spin our yarn, and this is going to be wool spinning, or wool yarn, we then can dye it. And I have to wet it first, and before that I really had to boil it to get it clean, because it's very dirty at first, so you have to clean it. So this has been washed and I've wetted it. My indigo, this is a vat. I keep it in this jug. It's really kind of old, but I've tried to freshen it up by feeding it. And I did feed it a little bit of ammonia. People used to use urine for that. That's a very funny story about the dyers, that they had to live 5 miles out of town because nobody wanted to be around them.
I bet.
It's a smelly job, but ammonia works nice, and you can use a chemical to help bring the color out of the indigo, which starts with as a leaf, but then you have to do lots of things to change it to the blue, to get the blue dye. But you could also feed it with fructose, so I made my own by just boiling some pear, fig, muscadine, all these fruits, and made some fructose. All right, so this is my vat, and I'm going to dip. And you're going to notice the indigo is very interesting because the feeding it, it's going to turn it kind of a greenish color. So I'm going to dip it just a little bit. And you'll see when it comes out, it's kind of green. Can you see that color? But as it oxidizes, I was going to put gloves on. I didn't. As it oxidizes, that was just a very short dip. But we need some air to get to it, and then it's going to turn blue. I'm going to dip it again because it needs a little more. You generally, for darker colors, and this may not get too dark because it's pretty weak, but you can leave it 15 or 20 minutes. I'm just going to have blue hands. Squeezing it back in. We're going to let the air get to it just a little bit. See, it's probably going to take a lot of dips to get a good blue color. but the oxygen's going to turn it from that greenish to a bluish.
Jeanette, I have this residual memory of something I read about there being a certain element of danger back in the day when they were in those indigo vats with their feet. Am I?
It may depend on what they were using for their alkali. You had to make it alkaline vat, and I can imagine that might have some danger with long term. But if this had been a stronger vat, this would have been darker, and we can hardly see, but you can see that it's slowly turning blue. But it takes a lot of oxygen too to get it blue. But I'm going to keep dipping, and we will finally have some shade of blue. But this indigo is several years old.
I was going to ask.
You can keep it as long as you keep it covered, and then feed it every now and then. You can revive it.
So there's some fermentation there?
It is the fermented that is good. A lot of people do that. Mine sometimes is a chemical vat, but
well, the chemical that you have there, that's not the color blue. It's something else, isn't it?
this actually is dye remover.
Oh, okay.
That's the chemical that, indigo is very complicated. It's a very complicated, and I can't always explain it chemically, but I know that if you were to take the indigo leaves and you were to add boiling water to them and let it sit, you've got the beginning of indigo, but it will not ever dye blue at that point without doing these extra things to it. So we're getting darker as we dip and as we oxidize. But anyway, it'll never be navy blue because my dye is too weak for that, my old dye.
Am I right that you started that with the leaves?
This actually, I have to buy my indigo because I don't grow it, but I did grow some one year. I grew a Japanese indigo, and it supposedly, in Virginia or somewhere, they tried to make indigo as a cash crop, back in the days. It was short-lived because the better indigo came from Europe, and so they... see, my hands are turning blue.
Yeah, it's working on that, isn't it?
Yeah, but it is, you see, it is changing. It is becoming a darker blue as we go. The more dips, the better.
I can smell it.
But we'll see. And I could just leave it. If that's enough, we could just leave it and look at it later, or, if that gives you the idea.
Yeah.
What I'll do next is hang it up to dry, and then oftentimes I will boil them later just to get out any extra loose dye. You can boil it.
Okay, and it's, I wanted to ask about the color fastness of it.
Indigo sometimes rubs off.
Because I rub it off on my jeans
like your
sometimes.
jeans. They call it crocking, but you can minimize that to a point.
Yeah. So if you grew indigo here, and to get it to that powdered form, they would have dried and powdered the leaves, right?
Right.
Okay.
They would. This all started as a leaf.
Okay.
Because that's where the plant, that's where the dye is. But
Isn't
anyway,
that interesting?
We are getting there with our indigo, but it does need to soak a while.
And you're using the flax, right?
This is actually wool.
Wool, okay.
Actually alpaca. But I'm going to let it just sit a while, and we'll see later what happens to it. We don't want it to. Got some spotting. And let's see. You see here, and I may just dump it in this water and see if how that, because sometimes that darkens it because of the oxygen in the water.
You really have to be a chemist to understand all these things.
I don't know if you can see much change because our room is kind of dark, but I can tell there's change.
I can tell there's changed from the green look.
Yeah. So, and the water will.
What are the surprising colors you get from, or are there?
Sometimes you get surprises with like greens, copper. You can add a little copper
That's
to
right.
change. So you can tell this is more greenish.
Mm-hmm.
Well, copper will add. That's actually this was the goldenrod just like this, but it was in an iron pot. So the rust, made that difference. Just iron. Well, this, after you've spun your yarn and you've dyed it the color you want, then you would go to the weaving loom and weave it. And this is my pattern, the Maltese cross. I like that design. It tells me how to thread the loom for this design. I write out that threading pattern, and all these different heddles are holding threads. And so this is my guide for threading. I'm having a little bit of issue there. And now I've got to weave it. I follow a weaving pattern, and it's very similar to threading, but it just tells you how many times you are going to raise up these harnesses. Start with 1 and 4. That's what my pattern tells me to do. 1 and 4. And then I will take my shuttle and I'll pass it through. And then I beat. And this particular pattern I have to, every other thread is a white thread, so that, or an off-white thread. And I beat. I need to do 1 and 4, raise up 1 and 4 a second time to make this pattern. And then beat. Raise up 1 and 3.
What is the name of this loom?
This is a jack loom or a floor loom. It's just a simple loom. It only weaves like 22 inches wide. So just like the coverlet panel over here, you would have to weave several of them to get it wide enough to fit your bed if you want to do a bed cover. This is actually just a little cup rug, they call it, or a little coaster that I'm weaving today.
In colonial and pioneer era, women would have to do this a lot to provide for their families, right?
They would. And before the Industrial Revolution, those late 1700s, they sat at the loom and made everything they wore, or their covers, their bed towels and sheets and blankets. They set the loom. But we know even after the Industrial Revolution or during the American Revolution, even though they could buy a lot of those things, a lot of people went back to weaving and spinning because they couldn't get from England the products they needed. So they had to do it. They had to be self-sufficient. So during the American Revolution, they were still doing this. And, we know that it continued all through the 1800s. Spinning and weaving, because you wouldn't always have the money to buy ready-made things that were being sold from England, or in the few factories, I guess, that finally happened. I'll weave a little more. I'm depressing the harness 3 and 4 to make the next part of my pattern. And I have to do that 3 times. So 3 and 4 again. Neat. And 3 and 4 for the last time. And I keep marks to keep up with where I am. But that's how you would weave, and the pattern comes from the way you thread each one of these harnesses.
How long does it take you to weave a panel of a coverlet like that?
Oh, hours, hours. It's hard to say because it also depends on your length. This one was just a sampler, just because I like the pattern, and I repeated it twice. This is half of it, and then I repeated it a second time. But for a bed, I'd have to make it a lot longer than that. So, also when I was using a purchased yarn, blue wool yarn for this, and I didn't take in consideration how much it would shrink. And this shrunk a lot more than I intended it to do.
After it was woven?
After it was woven, you have to wash it, and that kind of felts it. You don't want to felt it, but you want to kind of make it a little more compact and not have very much loose spaces.
Yeah.
But it shrunk a lot more than I meant for it to. My homemade yarns, even though I put them in boiling water and all that, I don't get that shrinkage as much as I did on this purchase yarn. So I don't know. My others, they're in another room, but the ones I've made, I had hardly any shrinkage at all. I use my homemade yarns.
What's the name of that pattern?
This pattern is Lee Surrender. So it's always funny, the coverlets, were named by whatever was going on at the time, the political whatever, or it was just funny how they named their patterns after.
That must have been a northern pattern.
It could be, or it could be one of those, states that some were happy the war was over. Yeah. I'm sure most people were happy it was over, so maybe they were glad. But I love the pattern. Whoever came up with it just came up with the most beautiful pattern, regardless of its name.
Looks so complicated.
And it's all the complications in the threading, and then, of course, they call the weaving, you thread it a certain way, and you can weave it following that same threading pattern, and they call that trompe. This is tromping as written. You step on follow the same. It's just funny the terms they use, but trompe as writ. But anyway, I follow. A lot of people have interpreted these patterns in these old books, and so I just follow because they've already got it all nicely planned out. I don't have to think.
You don't have to reinvent the wheel, huh?
But I'm going to do the cat tracks and snail trail next. Even though Wandering Vine is another name. All of them have lots of different names. But I don't know, that one seems so fascinating for some reason.
Out of all of your looms, is this the one you use the most?
I, for some reason, do. One of the reasons is that I've set it up with enough heddles to do whatever I wanted. You have to have the right amount of heddles. Mm-hmm. This one, I had borrowed heddles off of it. So now I had to buy new heddles so now I can use that one however I wish, because I've finally added enough heddles to make something. Because you have to have a lot on each harness. You have to have a certain amount on each harness.
And the heddles are the wires, correct?
Are the wires, yeah. And see, this has lots on each side. I've only used a few. But you have to have enough for these complicated patterns.
I guess those early looms also used wire as heddles.
Sometimes they would use even cloth. They would, have, they would tie their strings into, knot a little loop and use strings. A lot of them had string heddles. That would be maddening.
Yeah.
But, and there are different types of them, but it's amazing people came up with this. Now, when they came up with weaving on a loom, I can't really say, but
That was probably the early ones, like that frame.
probably.
I was
well,
looking.
those were, that's Navajos are the ones that use that particular one. But yes, if you look at any of this Egyptian weaving, they had upright looms. Some of them, though, they had the horizontal looms. And then they graduated to the upright loom. So horizontal was first.
Really?
They would put 4 stakes on the ground and stretch it out.
Uh-huh.
And then, I didn't show you my warping board, but they would have to warp their threads from one peg to another to get the length they want.
Right.
And then they would tie it on that horizontal loom. And then somebody would be on one side of it, somebody would be on the other side, so they could pass the shuttle from one side to the next.
It was a 2-man job, wasn't it?
It was at least a 2-man job.
Well, the itinerant weavers who used to, they would come to communities.
Right.
They would bring their own cards, right?
When they would do this type weaving first, but then, the jacquard loom, was something that had to be invented.
Yeah.
Had to come, and that was later on. But they were weaving this way, even the traveling ones. Or they would come to a town and they would set up shop somewhere, and then they would go to somebody's house, decide what kind of pattern they wanted. And a lot of times, that homeowner would provide the thread.
Right. I think they were using the materials that they had been harvested there at that.
Right.
That's what I had understood.
And they would
about
turn it over to that person, and then they would go and weave. And the jacquard loom was later. These coverlets were done way before jacquard.
Were they?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Because
I've got
then
one.
they got very complicated.
I've got one in the exhibit now that's dated. It's got a signature block on there, and it's dated 1846. And it's very complicated.
Right, and they sort of fell out of favor. They said, somewhere about 1840, the coverlets did, but then it got revived because in Kentucky particularly, it got revived because there was a college, maybe the director of a college started collecting coverlets, and then he set up a weaving school, and he revived it, and so they were able to have a way to make money.
Yeah.
Even the late 1800s and on into the early 1900s.
I had seen in that book we were looking at as late as 1920 maybe. The woman was much older at that time, but she had woven a coverlet that was still connected to the early days.
And of course the natural dyes were used until almost 1900.
Yeah.
Because even though they came up with those commercial or those, just call it commercial dyes, after 1840, 1850 something, they weren't real reliable until much later. They had problems of them being real reliable till way after 1900. So people were still naturally dying. So almost the 20th century. Of course, it now is revived again too. A lot of people
Right.
like to play around with it.
Yeah, it's has a different hue, I guess.
It's definitely earthy.
Yeah, subtle. There's a subtlety there.
Yeah.
Well, I certainly am glad you revived it.
Well, it's
and
just
let us learn from you.
curious, just that curiosity. I just had it, and I just
Yeah.
after I retired from my job, I thought I'm just going to play.
Well, what a good thing to play with. Plants and dyes and fibers and
So it's fun,
Wonderful.
and it's fun when you can share it. You know, I never
Yeah.
feel quite good at that, but anyway,
oh, you are good at that. I'm thinking about how you said that you had gotten your first wheel in 2000, and you know we started having Pioneer Days in 2001, 2002.
right. Share is the way I got started at your Pioneer Day,
Uh-huh.
because she came. I set up at the Hummingbird Festival one year just to demonstrate, just for fun, because I thought it was something of nature that could be shared, and Shara came and
Yeah.
she invited me.
Well,
So
we've had a lot of good years doing that, and you know I've got photographs that go way back. The kids just sitting there mesmerized.
it was always fun to see the kids, and hopefully they learn, you know, a little bit about history that way.